Next, we have Ms. Sanusha Naidu, who's a Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Global Dialogue and a guest lecturer at the University of Cape Town. Over to you.
Thank you, Pilani, and good morning. Still morning. You don't know in South Africa the way we're moving these days. But just to say good morning to everyone, to the diplomatic community, all protocol observed, chairperson of the BRICS, and so forth. This is a very interesting topic because I think it's one of those topics that I've been part of from the time it was conceptualized and the inception of BRICS in South Africa as a think tank, etc. And it's very nice to actually see where it has come to, from the actual thinking around a BRICS think tank for the South African academic community, to the fact that we're now sitting with concrete projects, concrete research, and talking to individuals like my colleague on my left around indigenous knowledge systems and so forth. I'm not going to be giving such a granular presentation because I'm more of a global kind of governance, international relations, a thinker, and hopefully an expert, I'm not sure. But one of the things that struck me in both Professor Ari's presentation and the presentation that my colleague gave on universal healthcare was, how do you conceptualize BRICS in the 21st century? And the starting point of that statement is, you are living in an international system, you're living in a world that is constantly evolving. It's a moving target. And being a moving target, it means that you've got to find the space, and how you find that space is, yes, you create a grouping like BRICS, but BRICS then becomes part of this moving target of the international system, and you need to find the balance within that system, and how you shift that balance, whether it's the narrative on development, whether it's the narrative on, you measure GDP per capita as growth, whether you use the World Bank indicators. That's the balance, and the balance is constantly evolving. And within that whole context of a moving target, you've got to find your identity as a grouping. And hence, that is why we suddenly start coming up and seeing beyond the BRICS Incorporated or et al. Becoming the narrative that counteracts the BRICS. But not to also say that on the other side of the BRICS, we've got to be realistic about what the BRICS can do and what it can't do. So within the moving target, I think what's important is what became a key issue for us, for those of us like Francis and others, Subramanja Zondi, etc., colleagues from SIA and so forth, who were thinking about governance within this moving target. Because the governance debate has evolved substantially in the last several years, if not starting with the Millennium Development Goals, where that was a key feature, and started the process of what I now see as the inclusive development, inclusive growth argument around 2030, we leave nobody behind. And within that context of finding your middle ground, you've got to do two things. You've got to be able to position yourself at the international level, but also address your domestic priorities. It's about reconciling your national interest with your global interest, with your self-interest. And that's what becomes quite critical for the BRICS. So when we talk about the BRICS, and we talk about the BRICS agenda and what the BRICS can do, I think it's very easy for us to get caught up in a narrative that romanticizes the BRICS. That there are those that see the BRICS as providing all kinds of alternatives. But I think we also got to take a step back from that and ask a more fundamental question. If we're reforming, what are we reforming in the international system? What it is that we want to create? To my mind, and perhaps this is where I become a bit pessimistic, is I see BRICS being part of both worlds. The world of the West and its own world. That for a country like China, it's about having the leverage of increasing its quota within the IMF and making the renminbi the currency, part of the currency basket. but at the same time using its ability to influence and shape markets, leverage the international commodities market, etc., by having what they call transfer payments, currency swaps with currencies that can swap and be paid in the renminbi. And that's what we're dealing with. I think we can't shy away from the fact that this world is heavily embedded in a global financial architecture that becomes interdependent. And that for me is very interesting. So when you're reforming, I don't have any problem with the institutions that have been created, but I think some of the fundamental reforms that we're talking about, whether it's the WTO and the Doha Development Round gets done or doesn't get signed or doesn't get ratified, it's about trims and trips, it's about non-agricultural market access and the question of subsidies, etc. We do see certain barriers being put up within the BRICS amongst themselves. And we have to recognize that reality in the context of this architecture that is moving at a rapid pace and is never constant. Because the BRICS, at the end of the day, are sovereign states with interest. And I can't see it any better than when I look at China and I think of they've come up with an amazing program or development program called the Belt Road Initiative. The Belt Road Initiative has become the all-encompassing development agenda for China. And the byline for that Belt Road Initiative is, we want to give back to the world what the world gave us. And essentially, if you unpack the Belt Road Initiative, it's got infrastructure, it's got security, maritime security, it's creating markets, it's opening up military bases, it's constructing. And it's the biggest development program to date that I can see where everyone else wants to be part of that. So there's an interest which in time to come, I think will actually find its way into the BRICS as well. And I think this is perhaps how the Chinese have conceptualized inclusive development. It is about taking development but underlining it with a socio-economic security dynamic. As long as people are included, you try to neutralize the threat of instability. But what happens when you can't do that? And that becomes the key point of what I think is going to become a key narrative, a key argument that we have to face in the context of the BRICS in terms of where we want to go and what we want to see. It then reminds me of a quote, and I will not want to badger this quote because Prof is sitting here and it's from Antonio Gramsci. But he makes this very interesting quote. He talks about, I think it's from his prison diaries, if I'm not mistaken. And he says, the crisis exists precisely in the fact that the old is dying, the new is yet or cannot be born, and in the interim, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. And I think that, in a way, characterizes this moving target of an international system. Because at the end of the day, when we talk about the BRICS, we're asking ourselves, what will be the BRICS in 2030? What will be the BRICS in 2040? What will be the BRICS in 2050? Would they have created universal access in healthcare? That goes back to Doha, goes back to the WTO. It even goes back to the Indian pharmaceuticals, who have now understood pairing up with Western pharmaceuticals provides them with market access. And I think to try not take up too much of time, but to sum it up, it's really within that context of the new normal that we're talking about. And this new normal that we're talking about is integrating this idea that nobody gets left behind under Agenda 2030. But it's also integrating the fact that we have to do this in the context of a development security paradigm. And when you think about that development security paradigm, there's a lot of things that would actually leave people behind. Because it goes back to how you protect the rights of individuals when it comes to trims, trips, and NAMA and agricultural subsidies. And so what happens when you do leave people behind? The disaffected are going to rise. They are going to challenge. And I think as we move forward, we could celebrate the fact that there has been poverty alleviation in China, India is trying to achieve that, etc. But these have also become very interesting enemies of themselves because of their geographical issues and their geostrategic tensions around the South China Sea, the Indian Ocean Rim, and of course, Doklam, which is the contested border disputes. So there's a bit of two things here that's happening. One, is BRICS just the development agenda? But can we ignore that at the peril of the global strategic interest that these countries have? And to conclude, I think the new normal is we'll try to get there. But if we don't get there, we'll continue and we'll catch you on the way. Thank you.